Hello, everyone. Welcome to this School of Modernities lecture, l'École des Modernités. I'm very happy to welcome today Stephen C. Wicks. Stephen is an art historian and is currently the curator of the Barbara and Bernard's Knoxville Museum of Art. And he has guided Knoxville Museum of Art's curatorial department for more than 25 years. And most specifically for tonight, this is an important thing. Stephen was instrumental in helping the Knoxville Museum of Art to build the largest collection in the world and the most comprehensive public collection of the painter Beauford Delaney's work. Stephen C. Wicks has organized multiple exhibitions. I won't mention all of them tonight, but I just want to quote a few because they include Awaking the Spirits, and that was the first ever retrospective devoted to the work of Bessie Harvey, and it was in 1997. He also curated Beauford Delaney and James Baldwin through the Unusual Door in 2020, and he's also the creator of Higher Ground, the Century of the Visual Arts in East Tennessee, and that is currently on view. Stephen's lecture tonight is called Beauford Delaney, Metamorphosis into Freedom. It's called Metamorphosis, I believe, because it will focus on Beauford Delaney's career through the idea of his coming from the US, from New York to Paris in the beginning of the 50s. And indeed, Delaney was born in Knoxville, studied in Boston, and moved to New York in 1922 before moving to Paris in 1953. And he participated here in the rise of abstract expressionism as much as reinventing figurative art. And I also would like to mention that it's also in Paris that Beauford Delaney, who has, and this is sad, for some reason quite been forgotten in the writing of the history and the artistry of the city, that he met again his friend, the writer James Baldwin, that he already met in New York before coming to Paris. So this is my very great pleasure to have the opportunity to learn more about the work of an artist that is, for many reasons, very, very important for the artistry of the 20th century and has not yet the place and the legacy he deserves in the art history. So I'd like to thank you, Stephen, for accepting this lecture, and the floor is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo. I appreciate the introduction. Thanks to everyone at Fondation Giacometti for having me, and greetings to everyone from here in Knoxville, Tennessee, the city where the focus of this talk, American painter Beauford Delaney, was born 122 years ago, and his birthday happens to be tomorrow. While Knoxville rightly claims Beauford as its greatest artist, I think it's also safe to say he's one of the 20th century's greatest modern painters. I say this based on the originality and authenticity of his artistic vision, the stylistic and conceptual ground he covered, and the depth of his emotional investment in each painting. All that he achieved is even more remarkable in that it involved him overcoming poverty, racism, self-doubt, and mental illness. In the next hour or so, I'm going to offer a few of my ideas about Delaney's artistic evolution, ideas inspired by years of thinking about his art and from the many opportunities I've had to view it up close. Many of these opportunities involved having access to the artist's estate, which has been based here in Knoxville since the early 1990s. Among the items I'm going to touch on today are Delaney's artistic evolution after reaching Paris and Baldwin's key role as an eyewitness, how Baldwin's words and Delaney's estate items shed light on this development, how Delaney's interest in light, particularly in reflective surfaces in an immediate environment, sparked new changes in his art. And Delaney's metamorphosis into freedom, as observed by Baldwin at Clamar. I also want to look at the breadth of Delaney's experimental approach and how Delaney's experimental nature flourishes even late in his career. And I thought I might close by touching on some recent developments regarding Delaney's legacy and how it's being anchored here in Knoxville. And on that note, I'd like to express my gratitude to Beauford Delaney Estate Administrator Derek Spratley for his continued partnership and support. For those who are not well acquainted with Delaney, I thought I'd include a quick overview of his career. He came from a remarkable family that was often on the road, as dictated by the changing assignments of Delaney's circuit preacher father. Beauford and his brother Joseph showed early artistic talent and received encouragement from their mother, Delia, who was a talented textile artist. Beauford's abilities attracted the attention of Knoxville's leading painter, Lloyd Branson, who agreed to serve as Beauford's mentor. And this atmospheric landscape is one of only 2 known works from Delaney's early Knoxville period. Seeking greater opportunity, Delaney moves to Boston in 1923 with the assistance of Branson and other Knoxville supporters, where he pursues formal artistic training. Most of the work that survives from this period takes the form of charcoal portraits done in an anatomically precise academic style. Perhaps more influential than any formal studies were Delaney's many trips to Boston's museums, where his notions about art were transformed by encounters with the work of modern masters, especially these 4, Matisse, Monet, Van Gogh, and Picasso. By 1929, Delaney settles in New York City, where he begins to apply his artistic vision to the production of distinctive modern portraits and urban scenes marked by bold, arbitrary color and impasto brushwork. He travels to Paris in 1953 for what he thought was a short visit and ends up making it a permanent move. In Paris, his studio practice evolves along some of the same lines as in New York, but with interesting twists and turns that we'll explore later. One of Delaney's qualities was his charismatic personality, with some friends even describing him as Buddha-like in his serene demeanor and seemingly endless supply of sage advice. In New York and Paris, he attracted a host of cultural luminaries as friends, none more steady or influential than writer and activist James Baldwin. No one, however, came close to the pivotal role Baldwin played in Delaney's life over the course of their 38-year friendship. Baldwin was Delaney's muse, his confidant, his protector, who inspired many of his greatest works, and who witnessed and wrote about new developments in Delaney's studio practice. Delaney played a pivotal role in Baldwin's life, and according to Baldwin, Delaney taught him how he too could become an artist, and credit to Delaney as his spiritual father who awakened his creative vision and taught him to see and trust what I saw. In 2020, the Delaney Baldwin story was the focus of the KMA's Through the Unusual Door exhibition, which featured more than 50 works, including dozens of Baldwin-related Delaney paintings, archival materials, and unpublished photographs, many of which were drawn from the artist's Knoxville-based estate. Unfortunately, the show's visibility was greatly affected by the pandemic. The exhibition explored the fascinating ways in which Delaney and Baldwin's lives and careers intersected and the degree to which their relationship bled into Delaney's work, such as in Delaney's urban scenes, which often depicted the Greenwich Village streets where the 2 men forged their lifelong friendship. In the many Delaney portraits of Baldwin that reflect the degree to which the writer served as Delaney's inspiration. In the Paris suburb of Clamart, where Baldwin visited Delaney and observed a new series of abstract paintings that he dubbed Delaney's Metamorphosis into Freedom. And then we see musically themed works reflecting the two men's musical talents and interests, some inspired by concerts they attended together. And here are Paris period portraits of American greats Charlie Parker on the left and Marian Anderson on the right. Delaney and Baldwin traveled abroad together frequently, and they relished the opportunity to view the world from different vantage points. Both considered themselves citizens of the world, and Delaney reflected these ideas in images representing international themes, as in this African figure on the left and a Turkish boat on the right. By the late 1960s, as Baldwin's involvement in the civil rights movement intensifies, civil rights themes begin to appear in Delaney's art. By the early 1970s, Baldwin has moved to St. Paul de Vence in the south of France, and it's there that Delaney visits him and produces what are among the painter's final works. Having provided this overview, I'd now like to take you down a few avenues I've been exploring recently. In most cases, my pursuit of these avenues was prompted by Baldwin's recollections of memorable experiences with Delaney. The first recollection I'm going to cite suggests the influence of reflective surfaces as catalysts for Delaney's experiments with abstraction. In the early years of Delaney's New York period, there's a noticeable shift toward increasingly adventurous color schemes, seen in comparing these two works from the Knoxville Museum of Art's collection that depict his mother on the left and his closest friend Baldwin on the right. His mother's portrait features descriptive color, whereas this very early Baldwin portrait, we see swirling iridescent colors that appear largely subjective. Here's where Baldwin's eyewitness role sheds light on a possible reason for Delaney's experimental color shift. One of Baldwin's earliest recollections of his time with Delaney recounts a walk through Greenwich Village taken with Delaney in the early 1940s. I remember once walking in the village with the Black painter Beauford Delaney. We were stopped at a street corner waiting for the traffic light to change. And Beauford pointed down and said, "Look." I looked and all I saw was water. But he insisted, "Look again," which I did. And I saw oil in the water and the city reflected in the puddle. For me, this was a revelation. So here is Delaney finding something magical and metaphysical in ordinary surroundings and passing along the lesson to his protege, Baldwin. In its contours, Delaney's pastel portrait approximates Baldwin's features as captured by friend Richard Avedon at the time. However, we see skin tones replaced by a fanciful and adventurous color palette. Might it be a reference to the puddle in Baldwin's creative awakening? Shortly after our museum acquired this work, I began investigating the inscription in the lower right, which dedicates the work to a John Arvonio. And so I set out to find the person behind this name and to see if it might lead to any clues explaining Delaney's color scheme. It turns out Arvonio was an experimental filmmaker and photographer who knew Delaney and Baldwin well. What I found remarkable is that Arvonio's most famous work is a short film, Abstract and Concrete, which features a 10-minute sequence devoted to none other than colorful reflections in New York City street puddles. So, did Baldwin's puddle story inspire Delaney's portrait or Arvonio's film? And why did Delaney dedicate the portrait to Arvonio? I also find an uncanny similarity between Arvonio's film imagery and Delaney's adventurous untitled composition from 1947. This Delaney painting differs from many of his late 1940s New York period paintings in its organic liquid bands of color, floating imagery, and lack of angular urban features. Beyond the puddle, I also see evidence that Delaney found artistic inspiration in other reflective surfaces in his immediate environment, such as ordinary windows. In 1950, at Baldwin's prompting, Delaney attends the Artist Retreat Center at Yaddo, New York, and he produces there a handful of works. One of the most striking of these depicts Yaddo's greenhouse from the inside looking out. For an artist like Delaney, whose primary artistic subject was light, that greenhouse must have appeared as a solar cathedral and ideal for his artistic agenda. Speaking of cathedrals, Delaney's interest in windows extended to stained glass. I came across Delaney Estate archival items on the left that included sketches and notes concerning stained glass. On the far left, it reads, "Stained glass Gothic Cathedral." We also see painted stained glass-like shards of brilliantly colored oil pigment on the right in his urban scenes of the 1940s and 50s. By 1948, Baldwin has relocated to Paris, and in 1953, Delaney decides to visit him and explore the City of Light. It turned out to be a permanent move, and the painter ends up spending the bulk of his Paris period living at several locations in Montparnasse. In my study of Delaney's art, it strikes me that Paris prompted the 52-year-old Delaney to become increasingly experimental and variable in his approach at the time. At this time when some artists of his age would have settled into a signature style or a singular path of development. Not long after his arrival in Paris, Delaney drags a reluctant Baldwin to the cathedral at Chartres, where the painter writes later about its stained glass windows as some of the most splendid creations by human hands he'd ever seen. Delaney even produces a painting loosely based on the windows, which is the center image, one that in its circular forms and patchwork color can be seen as anticipating a new phase that's witnessed by Baldwin after Delaney moves to the Paris suburb of Clamart in 1955. That year, Baldwin and friends noticed that Delaney, who was plagued throughout his life by destructive inner voices, is showing signs of psychological distress. They intervene and decide to move him to the tranquil, wooded environment at Clamart. For Delaney, it's the first time his studio is located in the midst of green spaces, not the asphalt and concrete of the inner city. According to James Baldwin, Clamart's natural environment sparked profound changes in Delaney's work. And I'll read you a quote. At Clamart, Beauford's paintings underwent a most striking metamorphosis into freedom. There was a window in Beauford's house at Clamart. This window looked out on a garden, or rather, it would have looked out at a garden if it had not been for the leaves and branches of a large tree which pressed directly against the window. Everything one saw from this window, then, was filtered through these leaves. And this window was a kind of universe, moaning and wailing when it rained, black and bitter when it thundered, hesitant and delicate with the first light of morning, and as blue as the blues when the last light of sun departed. Well, that life, that light, that miracle are what I began to see in Beauford's paintings. I want to now share with you what I consider to be a treasure, rare video footage of Delaney being interviewed in his Clamart studio around 1960 or 61. And notice when you're looking at this video, the studio window that Baldwin writes about, and it appears to the right of Delaney's easel. And the interviewer is asking him about how he came to be named Beauford or Beaufort, and Delaney explains it was the name of the midwife who helped birth him.
Paraît beaucoup plus stimulant Et après, on retrouve ce qu'on a de canadien. Je sais pas, on acquiert beaucoup plus de personnalité, peut-être en restant, en vivant à Paris qu'en restant peut-être au Canada.
Vous venez des États-Unis, mais Beauford Delaney, pourquoi votre nom est-il français?
Dans l'occasion de ma naissance,
De votre naissance.
votre naissance, une dame sagesse avec mon
Une
mère,
sage-femme.
une sage-femme avec mon mère, née Beaufort, Caroline, Norte, le sud des États-Unis. Ma mère a une bonne affection pour cette dame. Pour ça, donnez-moi le nom Beaufort.
À qui?
What an amazing resonant voice. Delaney's correspondence indicates Baldwin's visits to his Clamart studio were sporadic at best. To cope with this new isolated existence, Delaney mentions in its correspondence a growing interest in looking inward and making art concerned with the expression of light coupled with circular movement, the beginnings of which we saw in that shark painting from 1954. In essence, this studio window at Clamart becomes a portal through which inspiration from nature's changing display pours into his work. He's responding to his isolation, to the passing moments in nature's daily display, qualities that his previous studio settings lacked. He produces a wealth of watercolors at Clamart, a medium that offered him the advantage of greater spontaneity and the ability to capture atmospheric effects moment to moment. And looking closely, we see vibrant spiraling movement and rhythmic splashes of glowing pigment. We see a great range of painterly effects from delicate monochromatic washes, as on the left, to dense encrusted surfaces embellished with sand and powdered pigment, as on the right. In some cases, Delaney produces concurrent works featuring only the slightest variations, almost like he's tuning into particular frequencies of hue, contrast, and texture. In studying Delaney's Clamart paintings, it strikes me as if the geometric color shapes of his earlier urban scenes now were ruptured and they released their contents in a way that creates new pictorial energy and possibilities. I see this release, this dissolution of boundaries, as being at the heart of the metamorphosis into freedom that Baldwin observed. It represented a freedom of life and light that existed beyond surface appearances to those like Delaney and Baldwin who cared to look deeper. Speaking of beneath the surface, we also see Clamart compositions that I've heard several colleagues say appear to them as containing some sort of glowing embedded presence, even faces hidden behind veils of abstract brushwork. I think this is a fascinating idea, especially when we consider examples of Delaney's post-Clamart portraiture. On the right are two examples of paintings produced years after he moves back to Montparnasse, in which we see figures all but submerged in the swirling abstract brushwork Delaney developed earlier at Clamart. Given this evidence, I think a case can be made that reflective surfaces, particularly windows, were key catalysts for Delaney's experiments with abstraction, especially after his move to Paris. I'd now like to draw your attention to other areas of experimentation that took place later in Delaney's Paris years. In the early 1960s, for the first time that I'm aware of, he experiments with screen printing in these two examples that reflect his lyrical Clamart period abstract imagery. During the late 1960s, he also produces several monoprints in which he pulls mirror image paintings on paper by pressing them against wet paintings. While the vast majority of his paintings were created using brushes, during the last decades of his career, he occasionally produces bold abstractions created largely using a palette knife. And he pushes the boundaries of his portraiture to extremes, taking liberties with the form and identity of his subjects, as in these two representations of jazz musician Charlie Yardbird Parker, produced a decade apart. On the left, he appears to focus on abstract passages that suggest sound waves emanating from the musician's saxophone. On the right, he presents Parker as an African figure in a composition whose only overt musical reference is the notation inscribed on his scepter. In what turned out to be his last known self-portrait, the 70-year-old Delaney even took liberties with his own image, presenting himself like Parker as a youthful African figure. Only in this image, he is shown waiting attentively in an ornate bathhouse. Also supporting the idea of Delaney's liberal view of portraiture is his comment to friend James Jones. When asked about why his Ella Fitzgerald portrait looks the way it does, he responded, "I just painted something I saw in my mind." Delaney also contended that his portraits and abstractions represented one body of work comprised of studies in light. Perhaps nowhere is Delaney's subjective attitude toward portraiture more evident than in his many Paris-era portraits of Baldwin. The portraits vary in pose, coloration, proximity, and setting. Despite these variations, nearly all bear physical resemblance to Baldwin. One of these, the 1966 yellow and black painting of Baldwin on the left, has fascinated me for years and has always struck me as an outlier within this group of portraits. Of all the portraits of James Baldwin by Delaney, it has by far the least in common with its counterparts. While the other portraits generally present a Baldwin likeness made up of solid areas of color suggesting skin and clothing, the 1966 bust is an enigmatic charred framework whose delicate structure appears ready to crumble. Amazingly, only a few months ago, right in the middle of my research on this painting, another 1966 Baldwin portrait by Delaney surfaced at auction, one I'd never before seen here on the right. This Baldwin likeness is immediately recognizable. He is a solid figure in space. The weight of his form rests on his seat, and he's enthroned by the terrestrial world rising in the distance. How are these two paintings by the same artist? And how could they possibly have been created in the same year and depict the same subject? Perhaps nowhere in the breadth of Delaney's studio practice and artistic vision is that breadth more evident than in these two works. I began to ponder the lack of physical resemblance to Baldwin and why the figure's form is so severely fragmented. These qualities led me to think of the manner of an entirely different artist. Alberto Giacometti. I had read that he and Delaney knew one another and had lived only a few blocks apart in Montparnasse. And it seems natural for Giacometti to be in Delaney's thoughts since Giacometti had just died in January of that year, 1966. I see in Delaney's painting something of Giacometti's drawing and painting style, featuring clusters of wiry angular contours, diminished color, and figurative imagery, all of which was subjected to Giacometti's habitual cycle of vigorously scraping away and then rebuilding his figures. The relatively uniform backdrop and irregular bent contours in Delaney's painting seem to me Giacomettian and are a far cry from the flat color shapes seen in the bulk of Delaney's paintings. Not long after making this connection, I made a discovery while exploring a stack of works on paper by Delaney in the Delaney estate. I came across this 1960s Delaney pastel depicting Giacometti flanked by a couple of his signature elongated figures. Delaney knew dozens of artists personally, but his portraits of artists are relatively few. So this, to me, was a significant finding. Another unlikely bit of evidence surfaced when I was reviewing Delaney's correspondence at the Schomburg Center in Harlem in the course of my research for our 2020 Delaney Baldwin exhibition. I came across an April 1966 letter from Delaney to none other than James Lord, author of one of the best-known books on Giacometti that recounts his experience sitting for the artist over a period of more than 2 weeks. I'd like to read the passage from the letter that relates to Giacometti. Dear James Lord, have just finished your Giacometti portrait. It's a splendid statement of delicate ambiance between two friends. Your description of the temperament and of his dedication of all his forces into one universal source reveals the dominance of the artist over the momentary periods of indecision between patience and haste. This letter is written only 3 months after Giacometti's death, which may have prompted Delaney's interest in reading Lord's book. I think Delaney identified closely with Giacometti as an artist often racked by doubts, which Delaney likely alludes to in his references to momentary periods of indecision between patience and haste. Much of Lord's book is about the extent to which Giacometti's portrait of him involves these daily cycles of destruction and recreation, and how Lord comes to see Giacometti's portraits as portraying this internal struggle rather than his external likeness. So, looking at this Delaney-Giacometti timetable for 1966, we have Giacometti's death in January, Delaney's letter to Lord in April, and then in July, Delaney meets up with Baldwin and friends in Istanbul, where he begins the Baldwin painting. However, he soon leaves Istanbul and returns to Paris, where he completes the painting in his studio without the benefit of Baldwin's presence. I think this departure by Delaney prior to the completion of the Baldwin portrait is a key factor explaining its final appearance. My hunch is that Delaney's separation from Baldwin, along with his fascination with Giacometti's reductive portrait technique described in Lord's book, were instrumental in altering the DNA of this exceptional Baldwin portrait after it had begun, and in producing what I've dubbed the Giacometti effect. As for other interesting parallels in this story, just as artists Delaney and Giacometti were contemporaries, so too were writers Baldwin and Lord. I think an argument can be made that Delaney had visions of James Baldwin becoming his James Lord, a younger confidant who witnessed his struggles and who could chronicle them in proper fashion. In Delaney's comment to Lord about his admiration of the book's portrayal of the delicate ambiance between two friends, I get the feeling that Delaney clearly saw a parallel to his relationship with Baldwin and wished Baldwin would do for him what Lord did for Giacometti in the writing of his book. I wrote a short essay on my thoughts on the circumstances behind Delaney's unusual Baldwin portrait, and these will be included in an essay collection stemming from the 2020 Baldwin Delaney Symposium, organized in conjunction with our exhibition by Amy Elias, who's director of the University of Tennessee's Humanities Center, and she's the editor of the essay collection being published by Duke University. As for other Paris-era experimentation, we see Delaney's increased interest in civil rights movement-related subjects in the late 1960s, which corresponds to Baldwin's growing stature as a leading voice for the movement. Delaney's response takes the form of surprisingly descriptive and narrative canvases, including a series of paintings devoted to Rosa Parks that depict her not on a bus, but on a park bench, as almost as if a play on her name. And the final chapter of Delaney's career unfolds in the early 1970s in the south of France during his visits to Baldwin at the writer's new home at St. Paul de Vence. There, Baldwin and friends helped the increasingly fragile Delaney set up his easel, and the resulting works reflect the twilight of the artist's production before he's placed in a psychiatric hospital in the mid-1970s, where he remains until his death in 1979. As a group, these works are surprisingly descriptive and detailed, even in their reductive color schemes. I would have expected his final compositions to be minimal and abstract, but they are anything but. Here's another late work, one of several watercolor sketches of St. Paul de Vence in the artist's sketchbooks, in which he adds descriptive color to the intricate details of the countryside adjacent to Baldwin's villa. One of his last known works is a portrait of Baldwin, and it's also surprisingly concrete, built of uniform flat color shapes and largely free of abstract expressive elements. Interestingly, Yellow Cypress, one of his last works, strikes me as eerily reminiscent of that early Knoxville landscape from 50 years earlier. Compositionally, they are strikingly similar and share an emphasis on the sun, the eternal anchor of Delaney's illuminated world. While Delaney's sun has set, his star is clearly rising in the art world and also in his hometown of Knoxville. And I thought it might make sense for me to include a brief postscript about Knoxville's efforts to embrace the artist's legacy. Around 2012, the Delaney estate was thriving under the effective leadership of Administrator Derek Spratley, but it was in desperate need of safe and secure storage space. The Knoxville Museum of Art responded by carving out space in one of its high-security, climate-controlled vaults for the estate contents to be stored with access controlled entirely by the estate. Since our museum did not own any works at that time by Beauford Delaney, and knowing of our desire to represent Delaney's artistic voice within our galleries, the estate was kind enough to allow our museum to place 1 to 2 works from the estate on view in our galleries at a given time. Soon thereafter, the KMA, for the first time in its history, received discretionary acquisitions funds provided by the Knoxville-based Aslan Foundation's Rachel Patterson Young Art Acquisition Reserve. Beauford Delaney's art was an institutional priority for our museum, and so we were given an important opportunity to peruse the estate holdings and make a series of initial purchases in 2014 and 15, constituting 1 canvas and dozens of watercolors, pastels, and assorted drawings and other media. Our efforts to anchor Delaney's legacy in Knoxville received widespread attention well beyond Knoxville as early as 2016, but the most significant developments didn't happen in Knoxville until more recently. We made another series of purchases in 2017 and 18 that included 5 more canvases from the estate and dozens of watercolors and pastels. The KMA collection now includes more than 50 works by Delaney from nearly every phase of his career, representing nearly every medium and subject in which he worked, making it the largest and most comprehensive institutional collection of Delaney's work in the world. To finish up, I wanted to touch on other recent Delaney-related developments of note in Knoxville. In 2018, we installed the first permanent monument devoted to Beauford Delaney in Knoxville, near the site of the family's original home. In 2020, as I mentioned before, we mounted our exhibition, Beauford Delaney and James Baldwin Through the Unusual Door, the first to examine Delaney and Baldwin's creative dialogue. And in conjunction, we had that wonderful symposium organized by Amy Elias and the University of Tennessee. It attracted an international slate of scholars. Plans are also underway for a major downtown stadium whose primary residential building is set to be named for Beauford Delaney, and it's located very close to where the family's original home once stood. The Beck Cultural Exchange Center, devoted to Knoxville's African-American history, is in the process of renovating the Delaney family's remaining home in East Knoxville as a hub for Delaney family studies and related artist residencies. And just a few months ago, the University of Tennessee Library purchased the Delaney Estate Archives, a treasure trove of largely unpublished correspondence, sketchbooks, personal effects, and the artist's personal library. This concludes my presentation. Thanks to all of you for tuning in, especially those who have helped bring long overdue recognition to Beauford Delaney. If you take away anything from this presentation, it should be that Beauford Delaney was an artist who gave everything to his artistic practice and to those in his presence, and who walked into the studio each day with the courage and faith to allow the spirit to move him, independent of any expectations placed on him by others. And that Knoxville now represents a key point on Beauford Delaney's international map. So thank you very much. I would be glad to entertain some questions.